Well, good afternoon and welcome to this BGA webinar. My name is Leah Carter and I am Head of Events at Amber and BGA and will be the host of today's webinar. The topic of today's webinar is Teaching Business Ethics, Equipping Leaders to Address Global Issues, and it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker for today, Geoff Moore. Geoff is Professor of Business Ethics at Durham University Business School and was also a founding member of the UK Association of European Business Ethics Network, where he was chair from 2002 to 2004. He is also a member of the Society for Business Ethics and of the International Society of Business, Economics and Ethics, where he was a member of the Executive Committee from 2006 to 2016. Geoff is a member of the editorial boards of Business Ethics Quarterly and Business Ethics, a European review, and formerly of the Journal of Business Ethics. Having helped devise Durham University Business School strategy around sustainability, Geoff Moore will share his teachings on corporate responsibility, sustainability, and business ethics. This webinar will explore how business schools can maximize their efforts as critical providers of management education for a sustainable, ethical tomorrow. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our illustrious speaker of the day. Geoff, over to you.
Leah, thank you, and good morning, or rather, perhaps good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for that introduction, Leah. That's very fulsome. We've got three polls, or a number of polls that are run during the course of this webinar, and Leah is going to start the first poll now. So I think, as delegates, you should see a poll question come up, and you should be able to answer that. And we'll give it a minute or so, and then I'll get the results. And I'll kind of interrupt what I've been saying in order to just give you the feedback on that poll, and then we'll move on to the other one and the third one, etc. And there'll be a couple more polls during the course of what I want to say, and then right at the end there'll be an opportunity again for you to kind of type in questions, which Leah can then relay to me, and I will seek to answer those. So I hope that's all well, and I hope you can also see the slides.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So I wanted to start with a little bit of background about Durham University Business School, where I work. I think that's important. This isn't sort of corporate blah, as it were, about how good we are or how wonderful we are. It's just really to set a context for what we do and why we do what we do. So we are, as it says there, a medium-sized full-service school. That's to say, we have around about 4,000 students, 150 staff or faculty. We teach undergraduate, postgraduate, and we run research degrees, DBA and PhD. So it's in that sense that we're full service. We're also full service across the range of subject areas, finance, economics, management, marketing, accounting, and so forth. We're also one of the schools that has gone for triple accreditation. So as well as Amber, we're accredited by Equis and AACSB, and we're rankings oriented in the sense that we are, we put ourselves in for the Financial Times and the and various other rankings, QS rankings, and so forth. And that, I'll come back to that. I think that influences to some extent the strategy that we've adopted. We had a new dean arrived about 3 years ago, Susan Hart, and one of the things that she did reasonably soon after her arrival was to put in place what we've called, or what she called, a strategic framework. And as you can see there, it's a framework which incorporates ethics, responsibility, and sustainability. Indeed, one of my other roles here is I'm the Associate Dean for Ethics, Responsibility, and Sustainability. In other words, I'm the academic lead in that area. Let me show you that framework. The three bubbles on the right, research and impact, education, and student experience, they're kind of given to us by the university. The university is a research-led institution. We are a research-led business school. Research and the impact that that research has is very important to us. Then obviously education, we provide education, as I've already indicated. And then student experience. And as a university, the student experience is largely to do with what happens outside of the classroom, outside of the program. We're a collegiate university. We offer lots of clubs and societies and sports and so forth. our contribution as a business school to the student experience obviously is mostly related into the educational experience that we get. So in fact, our strategy for that area is for education and student experience combined, because that seemed to make sense to us as an academic department. But then in addition to those, you can see what we call the cross-cutting themes: internationalization, ethics, responsibility and sustainability, external engagement and connection with business and organizations, other organizations. And the idea of that was to say that these themes must cross-cut into all of those. So in other words, our research needs to be international, our education needs to be international, and so forth. And ethics, responsibility and sustainability also needs to cut across all of those areas in terms of research and impact, education and student experience, as does external engagement and connection. Now, I think that was a new framework developed about 3 years ago when the new dean arrived. It built on what was already there. It wasn't as though that was kind of something that came out of nowhere. So we've been doing ethics, responsibility and sustainability for a while. We hadn't called it that. And indeed, for those of you who are familiar with Equus, you'll know that that's the terminology that they use, although having decided to adopt it, we then kind of defined the terms ourselves rather than relying upon the Equus definitions for that. But we've been members of UN Prime since 2012, for example, so there was already quite a strong history of this area within the business school itself. Associated with the framework, of course, we put in place a vision and a mission statement, as you can imagine, and there's the vision, internationally accredited. The business school is proudly integral to one of the world's prestigious universities. Vision to lead business thought and practice to improve global wealth and well-being, and I've highlighted that just to indicate that we are right at the kind of front and center of what we think we're about. We are doing more than the sort of the wealth bit, shareholder wealth maximization and so forth. We're doing the well-being bit as well. At least that's our intention. And that's reflected in our mission to develop and infuse leaders and entrepreneurs who create, share and use knowledge to deliver equitable and sustainable futures around the world. So you can see already as I said, right front and center, there's something about us as a business school and what we stand for there, which is quite powerful. Now, before I move on, Leah, can I just check whether we've got that first poll in?
Yep, I can share the results right now.
Okay, right.
So hopefully you should be able to see it on your screen as well, Geoff.
Right, I'm struggling here. Where do I? Okay.
Don't worry. It was 86% said yes and 14% said no.
Okay, so in terms of having a strategy for teaching business ethics, the vast majority of you do have that. That's great. Okay. Leah, let's go ahead with the second poll then in that case, whilst I carry on talking, if that's okay.
No problem. I will, just so you know, I will launch the second poll. It will come up on the screen, so we won't see your slides for 60 seconds because the question will be up on the screen. Yeah. Okay,
so the question is up on your screens, hopefully. All right, well, let me talk to the next slide, and hopefully you'll get the idea of that and probably see the slide itself towards the end of the poll. What I've done on the next slide is to begin to move from that kind of broad vision and mission into our education programs, because obviously that's the focus of this webinar. We say the sort of things about our education programs that you would expect, be recognized as leading and contemporary and challenging and so forth, internationally orientated, linking up with that strategic theme that cuts across everything. And then we say our education programs aim to produce graduates that are prized for knowledge, skills and competence, equipped to become architects of a more equitable and sustainable world, That links back to the mission statement, but also is saying something specific about what we're trying to do with our students. And we follow that up by a much more specific aim, which is to enrich students' engagement with a more equitable and sustainable world by embedding ERS, ethics, responsibilities in sustainability, in a deep and relevant manner into all programs. Now that is ambitious and it's quite a commitment, but it follows logically, of course, from the vision and mission statement and from what we're trying to do from those into our education programs. Now, Leah, let me stop there. Has that poll completed?
Yes. Would you like me to share the results?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Yes. So just to let you know, so to the question, do you teach business ethics? 57% said yes and 43% said no.
Okay, fine. Thank you for that. I should have said earlier, perhaps, that when I'm saying business ethics, I'm defining it deliberately very broadly, but so that it includes, for example, sustainability issues, and I'll come on to those quite shortly. The third poll question is for those of you who are teaching business ethics. We'd like you to type in your module titles. Just again, so that we get an idea of the range of what those titles are, and therefore what kind of material they're covering. So again, presumably, Leah, that means people won't be able to see the slides for a moment. I'll carry on to the next slide and explain what that is whilst that poll is up. Is that okay?
Yeah. No problem. So would you like me to launch the third question?
Yes, if we launch
Lovely.
that third question, please. Yeah. Okay. What I've done on the next slide is to raise the question as to why should we teach business ethics? And as I say, business ethics is very broadly defined. And the first slide here, there's a couple of slides related to this. The first slide here, I've got instrumental reasons for doing that. And I think the instrumental reasons for why we should teach business ethics are related to the accrediting bodies, so AMBER, but also ACSB and EQUIS expect engagement. So if your school is accredited by any one of those, then you'll know already that there's an expectation from that accrediting body that in the school and its activities and its education programs, you will be tending to this area. Second instrumental reason is that rankings are catching up, so that the Financial Times Global MBA ranking now incorporates CSR teaching. I think it's 3% of the total ranking is devoted to, in effect, how many hours do your full-time MBA students get in terms of, well, they call it CSR, corporate social responsibility, compared with the total number of classroom hours, and that's the way that they score that particular element of the ranking. So, and the FT, you may know the FT is doing a broader survey of its rankings at the moment and trying to decide whether or not it wants to develop the rankings, taking into account particularly the sort of CSR, business ethics, sustainability agenda that hasn't been there up until now. So that's another instrumental reason. I think thirdly, employing organizations expect it. Increasingly, we see the employers coming to talk to our students saying, we expect you to align with the values of the organization. Our values will include kind of business ethics, sustainability, and so forth, maybe even aligning with the Sustainable Development Goals. And as a result of that, we know that we need to prepare the students for that world of work that they're going to experience. And the last reason, I think, is that students expect it. I've been researching and teaching in this area for well over 25 years. When I started teaching in this area, it was quite difficult to justify to students why this was part of their curriculum. Nowadays, we don't have to justify that. I don't have to justify that any longer. The students expect us to cover this. So that's why that's one of the reasons why we do it. It's not the only reason. I'll come back to the other reasons in a moment. So, Leah, have you got the results of that third poll there?
Yep. So 50% didn't answer. And then I did have a couple of questions for the title. So one person said the legal and ethical environment of business, and another person said management ethics. Okay,
right. Well, that's interesting. So obviously one person says you're linking that into the legal side, whether that's a choice you've made from a business school or whether the law department or something is part of the faculty. I'm not sure, but that's obviously a good. I mean, I tend in my teaching to make a distinction between, what the law says and therefore what businesses kind of have to do. And ethics, I think, I would argue, sort of goes beyond the law and sort of covers the grey areas which the law tends not to cover. And then in terms of management ethics, that's a way of coming at it. Obviously, I tend not to do that. I tend to come at it from the kind of more corporate, individual and corporate side rather than the management side. But again, that's I think a fairly common title, and a common way of approaching it is to come at it from the sort of management perspective. So thank you for those responses. We do have another poll, which was asking you to reflect on how you rated our strategic framework. Most of you said you had a kind of strategy for teaching it. How would you rate ours? And so, Leah, if you'd like to launch that one, and then I will move on. So I've covered the kind of instrumental reasons for why we as business schools might teach business ethics. I want to talk about, my next slide covers what I call intrinsic reasons. I think, again, there are 4 of these. I think climate change, loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services, the stuff that's going on in the UN at the moment, it speaks into our situation and says, well, we have to cover this. This is the world, unfortunately, the world that we're all facing. I've got a couple of other slides on climate change. I'll come back to those when this poll closes so that you can see those. But you may well be familiar with 2 major reports that we've had recently, one related to climate change and the need to keep the global warming below 1.5 degrees C rather than below 2, as was originally supposed. And then a more recent report this year on loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services, and the way that again is affecting the world that we're living in, and the seriousness of that situation. So I think that's one intrinsic reason. The other is that there are, as we know, ethical scandals and infractions. They impact upon businesses, they impact upon customers, employees, and workers in the supply chain. So again, there are reasons, that there are things going on out there that our students need to know about and understand, and hopefully be able to avoid in their future working lives. And that links into my third point. Why would we do it? Because we need to prepare our students for the working world they will inhabit. And I think that's going to be very different, certainly during the course of their whole careers, from the working world, the world as it is at the moment. Because as climate change particularly, and the loss of ecosystem services really begin to cut in, I think the world will be a very different place, and the working world will be a very different place. And it's our job as management educators to prepare students for that, it seems to me. And then my fourth intrinsic reason is that ethics is there whether it's acknowledged explicitly or not. So, if we go into a situation where what comes across to the students is that this is all about shareholder value maximization, and that's kind of repeated through all the modules, then inevitably we're putting forward an ethical proposal there, even if it's not acknowledged. And so I think we need to be much more upfront about our ethics and what the ethics are that are behind the programs that we offer and the modules that we offer now. So Leah, the next few slides I want the delegates to be able to see. So perhaps you could give us the results of that last poll, and then I can move on.
I'll just share them. So to the question, how would you rate Durham University Business School strategic framework and strategy for embedding ERS? 100% said good.
Great. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. That's very nice to have that feedback. And I shall tell the Dean when I see her later on today, and that we've had that good bit of feedback from you. Okay, thank you. I hope you can now see the slides again. I just wanted to put up 3 slides that I use in my teaching, and these are all about climate change, and they're just to try and illustrate to students. I mean, I use these slides in the first lecture I do on the MBA module, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a moment, just to illustrate the seriousness of the problem. So on this slide, we've got carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, parts per million on the y-axis, as it were, over time, over an extended time period. And the point I make is that, yes, there have been natural cycles to this. You can see a fairly clear cyclical process going on until very recently, when the line turns effectively vertical because of the very compressed time scale. And we're already over 400 parts per million now. We're heading towards what was used to be called the limit, 2 degrees C, 450 parts per million. Given what has come out recently, that really the target or the limit ought to be 1.5 degrees C, that equates roughly to 430 parts per million. So the point is that we are going very rapidly towards that limit. The second slide, this is taken from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out last year, looking at the 1.5 degrees C limit. And it raises the question is, well, when will we hit that? And the graph's quite complicated. I'm not going to go into all the details, but you can see the horizontal line at 1.5 degrees C warming relative to pre-industrial times, effectively. The two things that I've actually marked on that graph, the two dates, are 2030 and 2052. Now, the climate models that we're dealing with an extremely complex system. The climate models don't give us complete precision on this. So we end up with a range, and you might say that's quite a wide range. It is and it isn't. It means that within the next roughly 10 to 30 years, we will hit that 1.5 degrees C. Whilst we all hope it's going to take 30 years to get there, it depends, of course, upon the amount of carbon dioxide we put up into the atmosphere and so on and so forth during that time period. But the point that I make as far as the students are concerned is that it could be as soon as 2030. It could be that in the next decade. And for most of them, therefore, they'll still be in the early parts of their careers that we hit this. We hope not. We hope we have longer to transition to make the changes that we need to make. It would be nice if we had until 2052. We can't rely upon that. We need to make changes now to try to stop hitting the 1.5 degrees C. And the third slide I've got up here, again, I put this up. This is from an interesting paper that came out last year talking about the Anthropocene. The point about this is about what are called tipping elements. Each of those things, the Greenland ice sheets, each of those boxes, as it were, is a tipping element. In other words, if we hit that, then it makes the situation worse. If the Greenland ice sheet completely disappears, then we have black water absorbing the sun's rays rather than white ice reflecting it back into the atmosphere. And therefore the warming accelerates rather than decelerates. So it's a kind of positive feedback loop, things getting worse. And you can see that there are a number of those that would hit between 1 and 3 degrees C, a number of other ones that would hit between 3 and 5, and then a few that would hit if the temperature was greater than 5. The point is that this positive feedback loop means that things will get out of control. And that's what that bit of text is saying on the right-hand side. Within the Anthropocene, if you haven't come across that term, then look it up. There's some good stuff and little videos that you can show, which is good in teaching. There's the potential for tipping points to occur, leading to a cascade of irreversible climate change elements, posing severe risks for health, economies, political stability, and ultimately the habitability of the planet for humans. And the point I make is that hence that's why we've got this proposal to keep global average surface temperature rises below 1.5 degrees C. Now, I'm going to move on from there, Lee. I think I might just hold the last poll just so that we can complete my presentation and then have lots of time for questions, and we'll maybe do that last poll towards the end.
Of course.
Okay, so I've covered a lot of the background. How do we actually embed, or how could we actually embed business ethics, again, broadly defined, into the curriculum? And I think there are really two broad approaches. One is to say all students need to have a core business ethics, and again, put it in quotes just to say broadly defined module. And in addition to that, they need material in other core and optional modules, and maybe some specialist optional modules in addition to that. The second approach is to say, no, we're not going to have a core module. but we're going to embed business ethics in most, if not all, core modules, so that students will get to see it across the curriculum. In addition to that, it's likely to get some embedding in optional modules and maybe some specialist optional modules as well. Now, I think, so the real distinction between these two broad approaches is, one is to say you've got to have a core module on business ethics that covers this material, and then you do other stuff elsewhere. And the other is, no, you don't want a core module, partly because people say, oh, ethics was there and it's not anywhere else, so therefore we want to embed it everywhere else. And we've adopted both of those approaches here. I'll come on and explain a little bit more about that in a moment. A question really is whether or not you do things differently undergraduate versus postgraduate. Again, we have done that, or at least to some extent we have done that, and I'll explain that a little bit. I'm not sure that's necessarily justifiable, but one of the reasons that we've done it is to do with resources. How many faculty have we got whose teaching and research is dedicated to this area? And my answer here for us out of 150 staff is 2. Myself, and obviously I'm both teaching and researching, as you would expect, and we have another member of staff who's on a teaching contract, and he teaches other things besides, but his main area would be business ethics, and he teaches a module. I'll mention that in a moment. And that's the reason why we've gone down the route we have. We haven't invested in a large number of faculty dedicated to this area, though we do have a lot of faculty who do teach and research in this area, but being focused elsewhere. So we've got accountants who are into social and environmental accounting. We've got economists who are into environmental economics. We've got organisation scholars who are into kind of critical approaches to management and pick up the whole ethics things. We've got HR people, marketing people, and so on and so forth. And they will put stuff into their modules, and that's part of our strategy, as you saw, to say to people, whatever you're teaching, you need to embed ERS, ethics, responsibility, sustainability, into that, particularly in core modules. But we do have a couple of, one core module, and that's on the MBA program, and that's the module I teach, and I'm going to come on and tell you a bit about that. That's the way that we've done it here, is to kind of go for a kind of hybrid approach, seeking to embed business ethics into pretty much all core modules, and in a few cases giving them one case in particular, giving them a core business ethics module, and that's on our full-time MBA. So that brings me on to, so our approach, embedding ethics responsibility in a deep and relevant manner into all programs. That's what we said was our part of our educational aims. Most programs have no core business ethics, but seek to embed business ethics in existing core modules. The exception, the full-time MBA, where sustainability and ethics has been a core module since 2013-14. That kind of linked a little bit with our joining Prime, UN Prime in 2012. It also, to be honest, linked with the fact that I became Deputy Dean for Education in 2010, and therefore I was able to influence the school in this general direction and the curriculum in this general direction. And we decided to focus on the MBA as being the kind of flagship program. But in addition to that, we do have a number of specialist option modules. So corporate responsibility on undergraduate programs, that's the module that's taught by my colleague who specializes in this area as well. So not all, but a large number of our undergraduate programs in the third year, students can take that as an option module. They have already had stuff in years 1 and 2 of their undergraduate programs that deals with this area. So the corporate responsibility is in addition, and that's why we felt we would make it an optional module for those students who really wanted to follow that up. And then again, it's just another example on our MSc management. We actually have 2 modules: business ethics 1, ethical leadership, business ethics 2, society and leadership. And they are pretty well attended. They're fairly popular choices for students. So we have a large 300 plus students for MSc management, and we offer quite a large range of optional modules. Those 2 are fairly popular. One other thing I want to mention before I talk a little bit more about my own module, and that is that we do what we call an open course. So this is an online course on sustainability, ethics and responsibility, you can see that we swapped around the terms. Our broad area is ethics, responsibility and sustainability. We swapped the terms around because the course focuses more on sustainability than it does on the others, the other two areas. This is something we did in response to a survey that we did of all of our program directors to say, what's already there in your curriculum? This is a few years ago now. What's already there in your curriculum? How would you like us to develop this area? Which is where many of them came back and said, don't do a core module in business ethics, but do a module. Let us embed it in all the programs. But it would be useful to have something extracurricular. And we hunted around, didn't find anything that worked for us. So in the end, we developed our own course. Originally, it was an open course on sustainability only. We've revamped it. We revamped it last year. We've just launched it this year to link up to the whole area of ethics, responsibility, and sustainability. Even though, as I say, we've turned the terms round in terms of the title. This takes students around. We estimate around about 2 hours. There's quite a lot of input from myself and my other colleague who teaches in this area. But there's videos. We've got stuff from alumni. We've got stuff from practitioners giving sort of briefish, 3-4 minute video clips. There's exercises for the students to do as they go through. There's stuff at the end saying, right now, you've done this 2-hour course. This is at the beginning of your program. Here's ways in which in the university and in your program and perhaps more generally, you can build on this. So we try to leave the students with something to go away and do rather than it just being, oh, tick that box, done it. So we'll see how that one goes. As I say, it's a development on from the original course that ran for the previous 3 years. We think it's a lot better and the students will engage with it a lot more. 2 hours we thought was about the maximum. Ideally, students will do that in one sitting. The previous course took about 7 and we lost people because it was too long. We felt people obviously went away, didn't complete it in one go for obvious reasons, and then never came back to it. So we felt a briefer course was probably best. Okay, so let me finish really with some details about the module that I teach on the MBA, on the full-time MBA. Sustainability and Ethics is the title that we gave to it. It's a course, so the full-time MBA standard module is 10 sessions of 4 hours each. So long sessions, and obviously during the course of a session, you're doing a variety of activities, some input, some case study work, some student exercises and so forth. I thought I'd just lay out the overall content of it. So I cover sustainability. I do a lecture on the science of it. So the 3 slides that I showed earlier, they form part of that. A second lecture talks about sustainable development and business implications for all that. So it begins to become much more applied in the second lecture. That might seem a rather, out of 10 sessions, only 2 on sustainability, but the reason for that is that it gets picked up everywhere else, really, and particularly in the case studies. I'll talk about the case studies right at the end. Yes, there are only a couple of lectures, a couple of sessions, a couple of case studies on that, but it builds through the rest of the module. Then I move into business ethics. I do a session on ethical theories, both sort of individual level and corporate level. I talk about the issue of corporate moral agency, whether or not businesses, corporations can be moral agents, whether we can apply that kind of terminology at that level. The main theoretical focus is on stakeholder theory. I've stuck with that. It's not my area of research particularly. I'll come back to that in a moment. But I still feel that is what students will experience when they get out into the real world. That's still the stakeholder approach, if not theory, is the way that most businesses, most organizations conceptualize this area and think about it. And so whilst I do quite a lot on the theory side of things, it gives them the background to that. We then begin to apply it in the way that they will experience it in work. I do a session on work and labour and supply chain. That's to do with good work. What is good and meaningful work? What does that look like? And then I tie that in with labour in the supply chain, where obviously there's quite a lot of exploitation going on. And so we cover that. We look at that partly theoretically, but also in terms of one of the case studies that I'll mention in a moment. Ethical decision making, I do that, so that's the kind of the practical side of the ethical theories. So the theories is the sort of philosophy, if you like, and the ethical decision making is how do ethical decisions get made in business. So I want to kind of cover models for that and the ways in which that works out in practice. Strategic CSR, strategic corporate social responsibility, and you may know already there's a large literature that tries to measure whether or not being ethical makes financial sense. So it's at sort of organizational level, and these have become largely quantitative, very statistical studies of this. I don't go into that. That's not my own methodological background. But what I try to do is two things. I do try to give students an idea of the methodological approaches here, but I also try to pick up what the main findings from that are, which are still that yes, it does, ethics pays, as it were, that being strategic about it, tying it into your strategy does work. Not all studies find that. I'm very careful to kind of point out that there's a balance here. But that works, and part of the reason for doing that is partly it's in the literature, it's an important area, partly that if we've still got any students who are kind of ambivalent about this, if you can persuade them that it makes sense strategically, then why wouldn't they, as managers in the future, look into this area and seek to do well in it? Then I do stuff on managing business ethics, look at codes of conduct, look at reporting, sort of sustainability reporting. And then the final area on this is CSR governance in theory and practice. I want to make the students aware that there's a whole world out there now that kind of provides, if you like, a kind of governance framework for all of this. So reporting, GRI, reporting guidelines and so forth would be just one example of that. I link it into institutional theory to give it kind of an academic base, but then we also look at the vast range of practice, and indeed the assessment links into this area. It asks them to identify for a particular organization what that sort of governance environment looks like for CSR, which organizations and institutions might the organization that they're studying, it's a practical assignment, needs to link into if they don't already. In addition to that, I have developed some links, and these are great people who come along and give me a whole session. People from Nespresso, and also that links into some people from Goodbrand, a consultancy, a London-based consultancy, and also Walgreens Boots Alliance. People from there come and give me a whole session. So they run case studies, they give some input, and so forth. And the students, of course, really appreciate that because they're really getting the practical end of it. They tend to be towards the end of the module for obvious reasons. They've kind of covered the theory. We've done a few cases. It's useful to them, I think, to see it in reality and to hear people who are engaged with this. And then I use a couple of people for much briefer sessions, just an hour's lecture within the couple of 4-hour sessions. The Durham Energy Institute is one of our research institutes here, and they come and talk about what they're doing in this. Forest Carbon is a carbon offsetting business local to us here in Durham. In fact, it's run by a former MBA student of ours. He set it up. And so each of those comes and gives the students a bit of an insight into all of that. And then finally, I finished the module with sort of looking at alternative approaches to the stakeholder approach effectively, and link that into virtue ethics, which is my own area of research. So I give them some insight into that. As I said, each of these 4-hour sessions will have a mixture of things. So we do a number of case studies. I've highlighted the major ones that we do there. Gap frame is interesting. I don't know whether you've come across it. I've put the website up so you can go and have a look at it afterwards. It links into the Sustainable Development Goals. Instead of the 17 goals, it actually has 24 areas. It does it largely by country and region and globally rather than by business or business sector. But it provides an awful lot of really useful information. And the way I've used that is to get the students in groups I've actually allocated countries to them, and with our MBAs, we've got obviously a large number of students from different parts of the world. So in each group, there is one student at least from that particular country that I've allocated to that group, and they're to use that data available in GapFrame to produce a presentation about their country and about the sustainability issues that it faces. And then I ask them to kind of go on from there and look at the implications for particular sectors or particular businesses, opportunities that there might be for new businesses, challenges to existing businesses. And then I use a number of other case studies. These are the major ones: interface carpets, sustainable tea at Unilever, Apple. That's where we pick up the exploitation of labour in the supply chain. Uber. Uber I do slightly differently in that I set that up as a debate as to whether this kind of organisation is making because it's disrupting and it's disrupting regulation, legislation, and the way things are done. Is it a force for good or a force for evil, as it were? And I set that up as a debate, and the students have to choose which side of the debate they're going to speak on. They're put into groups to work up that, and then we have a proper debate during the session. So that works really well. They did it for the first time last year, and that works really well. And then Novo Nordisk, again, some of you will be familiar with that case study, picks up a number of aspects, particularly related to sustainability reporting that we hadn't picked up elsewhere. So that's the module that I teach. I hope that gives you an insight into that, but also maybe one or two practical things that you might want to follow up on, particularly the GapFrame analysis. I think if you haven't come across it, is really useful. So Leah, that completes what I wanted to kind of input into this. We could go back to the poll, which was: which reasons does your school use for teaching business ethics, instrumental or intrinsic, or both? So
okay.
Perhaps you might like to get that one going, and then as we get the results in from that, the final thing is an opportunity for you to ask questions, and I will try and as those questions come in, Leah will relay them to me, and I will then try and answer those. So I shall take a minute out to grab a bit of water, and then we'll carry on from there, trying to answer the questions.
Yep, I've got 38% of people have voted, 50 now, so I'll just let it run for another 40 seconds.
Okay.
Give it another 10 seconds. I've got about 75% of people who voted. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. And then I'll just share the results for the audience. So the results to which reasons, instrumental or intrinsic or both, does your school use for teaching business ethics? 33% said instrumental and 67% said both.
Yeah, okay, good. And that, I would say from our point of view, it's both sets of reasons. So that kind of reflects that. But I'm interested that there are a number of schools there who are doing it only because you kind of feel you have to, rather than because you feel you ought to. Okay, I think it's over to you for questions. So Leah, if you can kind of handle that and relay questions back to me, I will seek to answer those.
Of course, I'll just wait for questions to come through. Okay, so I've got a few questions, so I'll start with this first one. Do you believe that business schools have a responsibility to outperform corporate entities in reducing their footprint and impact on climate change?
Good question, thank you. We certainly have a responsibility. I mean, it's part of Prime. If you've signed up to Prime, you'll know that it says that we as a school will seek to reflect everything that we teach in our own and research in our own practices. Do we have a responsibility to outperform? I'm not so sure. I think just to give you an insight from us, one of the things we did in the course of last year was to employ a consultant to come and have a look at our carbon emissions. We already had, we've tracked these for the last five years or more. We already had a pretty good idea, but we felt it was time to really get an expert in to check that out. That taught us quite a lot, and the emissions are slightly higher than we thought they were. And the big area, which we already knew, but it turns out to be the biggest single area rather than being on a par with others, is flights. So it's faculty travelling around the world, basically. And what we are now about to do this year is to convert that into a carbon management plan. And I'm keen that we set a target for carbon neutrality. The date to be determined. Obviously, that will have to be part of a debate. Of course, we're part of a university. We will need to negotiate with the university, which already does some stuff in this area, probably not as much as we would like. And so we will need to negotiate with the university. Should we be ahead of business? I guess ideally, yes. I mean, I think in one sense we should be exemplars. But we know here, even though we're a reasonably large school, that getting the resources available, the expertise and the resources available to do that, we're still a relatively small business compared, So I look at the people who come and do sessions for me from Nespresso and from Walgreens Boots Alliance. They've got a vast range of resources, and no wonder they can do more and have more people focused on this area, more expertise. And in that sense, I think probably we tend to be a little bit behind the curve. Another area we've done work on is we're Athena Swan accredited. That's gender equality. We got the Bronze Award last year, and so we're now in the process of working through the action plan that we developed for that. So there are a couple of examples of what we're doing. I don't think we're ahead of business. Maybe we should be. I think it would be tough for us as an organisation to be able to do that.
Thank you very much for that. We have another question. So it's, when looking at corporate responsibility and business ethics, how do you decide which topic to prioritise?
Yeah, good question again. You've seen the topics that I prioritised there. I mean, I think there is no choice about doing sustainability. It used to be, if I go back 10 years, sort of environmental issues was one lecture. Now, as you can see, it's a much more major focus as it has become a much more focus for the world. I think to some extent, there are choices. You look at the different textbooks and you see that they take different approaches. They prioritize different issues. I think to some extent it might be related into the student body, the students that you're teaching. So I think that would be one factor in that. We know that we're teaching, particularly on the MBA, but more generally around the business school, we're teaching a very international cohort, and therefore we're going to focus. We need to make sure that the topics that we cover, so for example, exploitation in the supply chain, picks up through the Apple case study. It picks up exploitation in China. And you've got a lot of Chinese students in the room, and that's news to them. But it's deliberate, to kind of awaken them to the fact that this is going on in their own country, and were they aware of it, and what are they going to do about it? So I think a combination, really, of how would you choose, what's in the textbooks, what's really important out there in business, who are your students. I think that would be the kind of combination of things I would look at.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Geoff. I have another question. Sometimes, how do you convince leadership within the business school to prioritize topics such as business ethics and corporate responsibility?
Yeah. I think I relayed a little bit of my own experience here. Perhaps I could relay a little bit more of that. I joined Durham in 2004, so I've been here nearly 15 years now. And I came as the first professor of business ethics, so at least they had taken that step in saying, hold on, this is an important area. We need somebody doing this. It wasn't all that long before I was beginning to press them to join UN Prime, and I got nowhere with that. So in other words, they were kind of happy for me to research and do a bit of teaching in this area, but they didn't want it to become a core part of what the school was all about. That changed for two reasons. One is the dean changed, and then the second, as I indicated, was that I became deputy dean with responsibility for education. That put me in a position where I could influence the agenda in a much more powerful way. Does it depend upon the personnel? Yes, of course, to some extent it does. How do you change their minds? I think, certainly the sustainability agenda is so obvious now that to say to a dean, if they've not really got their heads around this area, you really need to get your head around this area, it ought to be an easy win. They ought to say, then are we going to put some resource behind this? Are we going to teach this area? Are we going to employ staff who've got expertise in this area? Are we going to make it a focus of our research? Those are bigger questions. But I think getting that buy-in from deans and other senior people is clearly important. And I think there's enough out there. And as I say, we're helped in a sense by the accrediting bodies because they're pushing on this as well. So again, if your school is accredited, it's on the agenda, and the accrediting bodies will be asking questions. So I think they're quite helpful. The rankings people, the FT, the economists, the QS, again, they're sort of helpful as well in this. So I think it's not that difficult nowadays to build a case for saying if we're not involved, we really ought to be. And those are the kind of areas I would look to.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Geoff. We have another question. This is an important week for discussions around climate change, as you mentioned. In your view, how can business schools do more to educate students and graduates on practical ways in which they as individuals can reduce their impact on climate? Or is the primary role of the business school limited to the teaching of reduction within the business context?
I think it's probably both and. I think to some extent, and this would apply generically across business schools, though perhaps mostly, or perhaps particularly for those that are research-led, we're trying to give the students sort of ways of thinking about the world, ways of theories that will last more than the latest fad, the latest fashion in business education, and indeed in the business world. And in that sense, I'm certainly within this if the students go away from my module thinking, right, this really is a big issue, but all of these, sustainability and the sort of the CSR side of things really are big issues. Then I think I've done, and given them some frameworks for thinking about that, given them some material that they can go to. Now, I would admit my stuff is not very, very practical, so I'm not challenging them at the individual level. We do a little bit of that, but I'm not challenging them at the individual level to say, so how are you going to reduce your carbon emissions? And how are you going to ensure that you work for organisations that don't exploit people in their supply chain, or if you find out that they do, how are you going to then tackle that? I don't do very much at that kind of individual level. It sort of comes up occasionally, but it's certainly not the focus. But there are programs, modules that do that, and I have huge respect for those who say we really are trying to change, as it were, the character of the students. So that they go away different people and will therefore behave differently when they get out into business. I've tended to take the more, partly because we're a research-led school, tended to take the more academic line, if you like, on that. But I think, in addition to that, being able to point to what we as an organisation are doing is important in that. In others, are we as an organisation walking the talk? And obviously, if there's a disconnect between that, I stand up in the classroom and say this, and the organisation clearly isn't doing this, then we've got a problem of credibility there. So I think the two need to go together.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Geoff. I think that's the end of our questions, actually, unless anyone wants to send me any last-minute questions before I let Geoff go and have his lunch. No, Geoff, I think that's the end of our questions.
Great. Okay.
So thank you very much for listening. I'm sure you all can agree that Geoff delivered an excellent webinar touching on some really poignant topics. Please tune in for our next webinar on the 5th of November on the future of Digital Business School campus, using digital learning to scale and impact at 12 o'clock. Geoff, thank you once again. Thank you all for listening. And have a great day wherever in the world you are today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.